Hello and good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. What's the weather like where everybody is? It's really turned autumnal and cold here over the last couple of days. Okay, so welcome to today's Learn with Lorna. We are at the 79th in the series, and this week we're looking at part of the life story of James Mowat. My name is Lorna and I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service. If you're not familiar with the service, we have 4 archive centres across the Highlands. We have the Highland Archive and Registration Centre in Inverness, Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, and Skye and Loch Archive Centre in Portree. And together the 4 of those make up the Highland Archive Service. And the purpose of this series of talks, as I say, we're on the 79th of them now, is to share different stories from within our collections to people right across the Highlands, right across the world. And it's so nice to see people in different places tuning in. So thank you. And thank you for continuing to tell people about the series as well. It's really appreciated. This series is brought to you by Highlife Island at no cost to the viewer. Highlife Island is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're in a position to be able to donate towards our work, then we very much appreciate that. I'm seeing your message there, Mike, saying that it's breaking up on your iPad. I've noticed a couple of people having problems with iPads in the last few weeks, but not a problem on other devices. Okay, so this week is the last in our series on life stories. This theme has taken us through the centuries and through many different life experiences of different people. Today we're looking at the story of James Mowat and particularly his World War II experiences, as seen in documents that are held in Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives. We hold up there a copy of his own autobiography, which is entitled A Far Cry from Caithness, and we hold the papers of the family business, the Portland Arms. Also the personal papers of his family, such as his mother's diary. So who was James Mowat? James was the eldest son of John and Mina Mowat, who ran the Portland Arms in Leibster in Caithness. James was a reservist with the Territorial Unit, and he was called up on the 1st of September 1939, 2 days before World War II was officially declared. And his mother's diary records those tumultuous events in her diary like this. Friday the 1st of September 1939. The international situation is very serious this morning. From all big cities they are evacuating children. Saturday the 2nd. James left this morning for Portsmouth. Sunday the 3rd. War was on today at 11:15 a.m. between Britain and Germany. The Terriers go out tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. This is the beginning, and no one can tell the end. Gas masks were issued on Saturday and will continue today. Monday the 4th, a British liner outward bound with American passengers is reported to be sunk today by an enemy submarine. So you get in that entry that the speed that James left to join his unit to go to Portsmouth, but also that feeling of the evacuation happening on the 1st, James leaving on the 2nd, war being declared on the 3rd, and a sinking of a liner by the 4th. So that very quick moving situation, and that quite chilling sentence, I think, this is the beginning and no one can tell the end. So James went from Caithness to Portsmouth on the south coast of England, so one extreme of the country to the other. By January 1940, James had been posted to northern France with the rest of his unit, who were the 4th Army Field Workshop, which was part of the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, and they joined the British Expeditionary Forces. And as part of his role, he carried out things such as routine repairs to guns and so on. But on the 10th of May 1940, the Blitzkrieg began. The Nazis concentrated, targeted and overwhelming attack on France and the Low Countries. And James's autobiography describes that moment like this. On the 22nd of May, we were just outside Saint-Omer in a little village called Saint-Martin, where German artillery started to shell. This was the first intimation that they were in the vicinity. As it was impossible to contact anybody for further orders, our CO decided to make for Calais. However, owing to repeated interference from enemy aircraft, we were forced to take cover in the grounds of a chateau, and it was here that we first contacted the German army on the afternoon of the 23rd. For a while they kept us under cover with spasmodic machine gun and mortar fire, our casualties in the early morning amounting to 2 killed and several wounded, a few of the vehicles also being damaged. About dusk things went quiet, and we broke out of the grounds with as many vehicles as were needed to carry them in. A quarter of an hour later, the convoy with the CO's car in the lead was stopped by a barricade of farm wagons across the road, behind which was an anti-tank cannon. The CO's car received a direct hit, and he and another officer were killed. With the convoy stationary, we were at the mercy of the German machine gunners. Trace bullets set fire to most of our vehicles, and after a short resistance in which many of our men were killed or wounded, the rest were taken prisoner. During the melee, and aided by darkness, I made a dash for it, getting to a field and a hedge and keeping going. Next morning when it got light, I took cover in a wood to wait for nightfall. For the next 4 days I made my way westwards, always hoping to get clear of the enemy and reach our own lines. As the days went by, the fact that my position was hopeless became apparent, although I refused to admit it, intending to keep out of the hands of the enemy for as long as possible. In the daytime I hid up in the woods and hedges where I could watch the German troop movements on the roads. During this time I had to take the risk of contacting French civilians for food, and although I did get a little, most of them were too scared to help me and turned me away. In this way I had one narrow escape. I went to a farm early one morning to find when I got to the door German soldiers already in the kitchen. I beat a hasty retreat through the yard and kept going. It reads a little bit like a spy story. I think it reads a little bit like a John Buchan or a Bulldog Drummond, but a real story and a real terrifying experience. Now, up until this point that James fled and went undercover, he had been in regular correspondence with his family. He had written a lot, and something that I think must have brought them a huge amount of comfort. And perhaps none of us can understand, unless, do tell me if you've got family in the military, I'm sure this will be familiar to you, but the fear, the constant fear of knowing that you have a family member serving. And then that moment that happened to this family in mid-May 1940, when his family stopped receiving any mail from him or any contact. And his mother's diary for the 27th of May 1940 says, We've had no letter or card from James for nearly 4 weeks. German bombers were intercepted last night. And then the 2nd of June 1940, went twice to church. Now 5 weeks since we have had word from James. I feel quite anxious now. You can imagine that she would indeed be feeling very anxious. And then their fears intensified, because on the 17th of May, 10 days before that entry in his mother's diary, James's father had written a letter to him. His father John had written a letter to him, which included these sort of normal greetings, normal conversation. Dear son, just a few lines to let you know what's doing. I see by the papers that things are fairly lively on the Western Front, but they won't come very far this time. We're fairly busy. The house has been fairly full all winter. Just started to pull down the turnips and the lambing is finished. The weather's very good. The vet's fine. I saw him last night and I've started to drive a car again. I suppose your mother will give you all the news anyway. I'd best finish now. Best of luck from your father. So just a normal greetings letter, trying to share daily news and keep his son feeling like part of the community. But the answer at that point was, what happened was his father wrote this letter to him, and the letter was returned to his parents, and all it said is, addressee is marked as missing. Now, the Mowats, his parents, incidentally, while dealing with this sort of terrifying, worst nightmare piece of news, were also now dealing with the war close to home as well. Mina's diary records the fact that on the 5th of June 1940, they had received a phone call to tell them that enemy planes were overhead and that a bomb had been dropped at Limekilns in Leicester, just very close to the hotel. So they're dealing with the fear of their son being away, and not that wasn't the only son. They had various family members away, and also the reality of the war coming close to home. And while this was happening in Caithness, James was struggling on in France, but he had found someone who was willing to help him. And his autobiography at this stage says, "While I watched to see if there were any Germans about, a farmer came into the field with a pair of horses. I called and tried to speak to him. When he knew I was British, he took me to a little cave in the side of the hill, and several times that day he brought me food, soup and bread. The cave was cold and damp, but despite this I slept for almost the first time in days. At this time my appearance was anything but presentable. I had a 5-day growth of beard and my uniform was plastered with mud and clay. In the evening the farmer came with some clothes in a sack, into which I changed, hiding the remains of my uniform under rocks in the back of the cave. After dark we went down together to the farm which nestled at the bottom of the hill. There a bed had been made up for me on top of the hay in the barn, a few clean sacks and 3 blankets spread out. After a wash in a bucket and some clean clothes, I was in a state of contentment. The constant mental and physical strain of the past few days was behind me, and I felt relaxed and ready for what might be in store." Which I find extraordinary. Obviously that would have been a huge relieving moment for him, particularly to get rid of that British uniform. But strange to think that you would feel content. Back in Caithness, James's parents were trying to find all the ways that they could, all the ways that they could think of to find out what had happened to him. His mother's diary records that they wired the War Office and received confirmation that his name wasn't on the casualty list. So that was a great relief, and she says that in her diary. It's a great relief that he's not confirmed as a casualty, but it's still not an answer to what happened to him. And the answer at that stage was that James was still safely hidden by this farmer, Emile Daniel, and his family. In addition to providing him with local clothes and getting rid of his uniform, they also helped him to shave, but left him with a moustache so that he looked more French and would be less identifiable as a British soldier. But all this was to change in mid-June when France surrendered to Germany. And James's autobiography records that moment like this. "In the middle of June, my status in the family suddenly changed. France had capitulated, and Gilbert woke me at 7 o'clock in the morning to tell me that German soldiers were coming round, searching all the farms and houses, and were right now in the neighbouring farm. I scrambled through a hole in the wall into the orchard, a pre-arranged escape route, and she gathered up my few belongings and bedding and hid them. From the orchard I worked my way under cover of a hedge to some trees on the hillside. From there I could watch without being seen and get away through the trees in the event of trouble. This was a piece of country I was to know as well as the back of my hand, my back garden at home. The Germans, dressed in overalls and obviously on top of the world, drove into the courtyard and began poking around in a casual fashion, and while standing looking down I got something of a scare. I heard a footstep approaching, and when I turned round I found myself looking straight at a German soldier. His surprise at seeing me was so obvious that I knew he hadn't been watching me, so I took the initiative and said, 'Bonjour, monsieur,' and he pointed down in the direction of the farm and murmured, 'Passez, passez,' and he walked on. Shortly afterwards, Gilbert came round the back of the farm, made a sign for me to come down, and for the first time I entered the farmhouse and met Madame. I had been there for about 10 minutes and was drinking a cup of coffee laced with brandy when we heard heavy footsteps on the cobbles outside, and Madame's face showed obvious fear as 2 German soldiers walked straight in. I realised that it was up to me not to panic, so I leaned over the table with my cup in my hand and said, 'Bonjour, monsieur. Café?' Thank God they didn't seem too sure of themselves, and they asked quite civilly if they could have eggs. Madame had by this time got over her fright, which was of course quite natural, and they thought that they were the cause of it. After she gave them some eggs, they thanked her politely and left. It had been a test for both of us, she told me afterwards. She had been desperately afraid that I would give myself away. The mutual respect and confidence derived from this incident made me one of the family as far as Madame was concerned." The result of that moment was that James joined them living in the farmhouse. So previously he had been out in an outbuilding and the farmer had been bringing him food. But because of that moment and that connection he had with the farmer's wife, he was moved into the farmhouse and worked on the farm. Now back in Caithness, the Mowats were dealing with the bank row bombing. I don't know if you remember, I spoke previously in an episode about World War II and about the bank row bombing. And they happened to be in Wick on the day that the bank row bombing happened. They heard the explosion. So as I've said, they are dealing with that two-handed thing of the fear for their family. They had obviously James missing in action. They had another son, Bert, who was in the RAF, but also they're dealing with the war coming very close to home in the Highlands. They wrote to the officer in charge of records of the Royal Army Ordnance Corps in Woolwich, and on the 26th of July they received an official notice confirming that James was missing. But Mina noted in her diary that she didn't believe he would turn out to be dead. She still believed that he would be a prisoner of war and that he was still alive. And now we know he wasn't a prisoner of war, but perhaps certainly hugely still at risk. And also, the other people who were hugely at risk were those people who were helping and assisting him. He recorded, "I became known to all the people in this little cluster of 12 farms and cottages known as Nordal, and they all helped Emil and his wife to feed me, sending in food, a bit of pork when they killed a pig, or a jar or two of homemade jam. They were marvellously kind and helpful to me in every way. The weeks went by and I settled down to help in any way I could and was accepted as one of the family. Then one day, the family was thrown into a state of alarm and agitation. Emil had returned from market and had been spoken to by the local mayor of Aquin. He had heard that I was at Emil's farm, and the mayor was afraid that in the event of my being caught, he, as the local mayor, would become involved. He insisted that I leave immediately. Emil and Madame hotly refused to let me go and flatly refused to listen to my argument that it would be better for them if I did. 2 days later, the mayor arrived at the farm, and finding me still there, he threatened to inform the Germans himself if I didn't leave. There followed a scene in which Emil argued and pleaded to no avail and told the mayor in the most uncomplimentary terms what he thought of him. It was sure, however, that despite all their arguments and tears, that I should have to leave. Emil said he knew of someone who would help and immediately left to see him. The outcome was that I received a visit from a Monsieur Ravet, a wealthy landowner in the district. He was very pro-British and anxious to help me. He said he knew of a farm some 7 kilometres away which was not visited by Germans, so all the arrangements were made. And the next day, Monsieur Ravet arrived early in the morning to accompany me. He says everybody came round, the neighbours from nearby farms came round, and everybody seemed to be weeping, including a few neighbours who were in on the secret and had come to say au revoir and bonne chance. I had a lump in my throat on saying goodbye to such brave people. But he only was in that new place for a fortnight when he records that the young son of the house came running to tell him that German soldiers had arrived completely unexpectedly, demanding accommodation for 8 men and stabling for their horses. As I got to the door, I met one of the soldiers, so I said in French that the patron was in the fields and that I would fetch him. I have often wondered what would have happened to me if I'd met a fluent French speaker. I found the farmer who hurried back while I settled down in the hedge to await developments. He came back very perturbed to tell me that 8 soldiers were to be billeted with him. I therefore made my way gradually back to Emil. Emil and his family were overjoyed to see their English son returning to them, and he spent the summer with them, helping with the harvest. And he talks about the fact that he fell into the rhythm of the work, all familiar with him of home. It made him think of working on the land at home. Unfortunately, there was a daily reminder of war events, of hundreds of German bombers passed overhead on their way to bomb England. We would try and count them as they passed, and the children yelled with delight when the depleted formations and the stragglers returned after every raid. They knew that I was very worried over what was happening on the other side of the channel, and every evening Emil and his boys would slip over to a neighbouring farm to listen to the BBC News. Each night, as the Battle of Britain developed and the German losses daily increased, Alfred would rush in to tell us that the score culminating in the evening was going up. Nevertheless, my anxiety increased as the French newspapers, which were German-controlled, reported terrific damages to British cities. In the meantime, this letter was received by James's parents. And you can imagine how they would have felt when this arrived in the post. From Corporal H.E. Tibbs, Stalag XXA, Germany. I'm hoping that this letter will reach the parents of Private James Mowat, late of the 14th AFW, known to me as Jimmy. I believe he came from Wick in Scotland, and should this reach his home, I just wanted to say how much I valued his friendship, and that during the whole of our time in France we were great pals. He was one of the best and most popular with everyone in his unit, and wherever he went he made friends. He was generous and considerate and was always welcome amongst the French families with whom we made contact. It was a great pleasure to have him in my section, and he showed great aptitude and ability and was always ready to work. In times of danger he showed the utmost disregard for it, and when volunteers were called for, he was always there. The night before we were smashed up, he bought me a drink, saying, "Drink and be merry, for tomorrow we may die." It's in this spirit that I shall always remember him, the night of the 20th of May, 1940. So a hugely emotional letter, I think, to receive. Lovely for his parents to hear how well regarded he was, how much he was loved, but just reinforcing that the knowledge that the unit had been smashed up, and that from that moment on, nobody knows where he is. James carried on working away in the field, in the farm, and his memoirs include stories of highly secret meetings with other British service personnel. Highly secret because the penalty for the people harbouring enemy factors, as they were seen by the Germans, was immediate arrest, resulting either in a concentration camp or execution. So these French people who were looking after him, giving him shelter, giving him food, were risking their freedom and also their lives. In 1941, he records a growing feeling that the Nazi war machine was far from invincible. The resistance movement was starting to grow and starting to pull together to assist Allied personnel to escape. And these meetings that he went to, he was hearing stories of people being given escape routes, being given routes out. And then finally, it was his turn. And he says, on the 14th of March, we were told to be ready to move on the 18th. I spent a last sad and tearful night with Madame and the family, and before dawn, Albert escorted me down to the rendezvous, where I found Rowe and Simmons waiting. After about half an hour, a light truck with a canvas cover came trundling along. It stopped, the driver gave us a signal, and we scrambled into the back, and within seconds, we were off. We travelled for more than 3 hours, apparently, by the number of turns and poor surface over second-class roads. Eventually we turned off to the right and proceeded up a muddy lane to a lonely country cottage. This was kept by a cousin of our driver who had been expecting us, since a meal was awaiting us. They departed later that day, so they were given a meal, departed later that day, carrying on, travelling to their next sanctuary, their next place of safety. James would spend the next 10 weeks at the house of Victor and Judith Cavignon in Berber, a mining community where resentment to the Nazis was very strong and very active. And you really get a sense of the underground network that was built through these papers. James recorded, on one occasion, a Sunday, Victor took me across the fields to visit un soldat écossais, a Scottish soldier, in the nearby town of Ochal, who had lived in France since shortly after the First War. On entering the house, we were met by a tall, dark-haired man. On being introduced, he looked at me keenly and said, "What part of Scotland do you belong to?" I said, "Caithness." He grasped me by the hand and exclaimed, "You're James Mowat, aren't you, from the Portland Arms?" I was thunderstruck. He went on, "Do you know mind Mac Macleod, who used to work with your father in the Portland Arms?" Memories immediately flooded over me, and I remembered the young lad from Dunbeath when I was 6 or 7 years old. Mac had married a French girl at the end of the war, had taken her from Dunbeath and their children and Elaine and Mott had been born. He had then returned to France in the early 20s with his family, obtained a job in the mines and settled in Ochil. Thereafter followed a long and extraordinary conversation. War and the occupation were forgotten. All Mac wanted to know was how things were in Caithness, and in Dunbeath in particular. Who was in such and such a croft, what had happened to so-and-so, who fished from the harbour, and we went through a litany of names that I tried to remember. We became completely engrossed for a couple of hours, and we were back in the parish of Latheron in familiar scenes and amongst old friends. Mac and his family were sheltering a Cameron Highlander, Arthur Fraser, from Inverness. We didn't meet Arthur on that visit, but during the ensuing weeks we exchanged visits, and established a close relationship with the Macleod family. On the way home, we walked in complete silence, my mind full of the memories that the visit had aroused. You can only imagine, I think, what that moment would have meant to him of meeting someone who had a connection to home. In May 1941, James was told that the next stage in his journey was going to happen, and he was briefed on the plan, which comprised a journey in stages to Paris and then beyond Paris, accompanied on each stage by a different person, risking their life, risking their safety to move these British troops across the country and home. One of these stopping points was in the home of a retired schoolmistress, and it was a key moment for the whole of the Mowat family. He recorded it. Slim and grey-haired, she was a typical schoolma'am, recognisable in any country, authoritative and firm, but kindly withal. She looked after us and fed us well for the 3 days that we rested with her. She astonished me by saying that she corresponded regularly with a friend in London, and she offered to pass on a message home from me. I hadn't imagined that this could be possible, but on the 16th of June, my mother received a letter from this lady in London, stating, "James alive and well in unoccupied France." This was the first intimation that my parents had received, and they had long given me up as dead. His mother's diary records the moment that that message came and says, "We are all past, beyond even being glad." She says, "I felt absolutely speechless." As James's journey continued, his memoirs record loads of insights about just how dangerous it was for him and for those people who were assisting him. On the train from Châteauroux to Toulouse, the person who was going to be their courier for the next stage joined the train earlier than they knew, in secret, and watched them for over an hour before approaching them, just to be sure that it was them and to be sure that no one else was watching. In the meantime, Mina Mowat's diary records the 2-year anniversary of James's departure for France and the 2-year anniversary of the war. James by this point was ready to cross the French-Spanish border across the mountains, so an incredibly difficult journey, as you can imagine. On the hour as arranged, our guides arrived, 2 slim, wiry fellows, sombrely dressed in black and unlike our image of mountaineers. However, they soon showed that they knew their business. Our boots were examined and found to be adequate. They went over Madame's rations and again approved. An hour after sunset, we said goodbye to our driver with many felicitations to the lady of the manor and profuse thanks to our host and hostess, and indeed, thanks to France. We set off full of hope, but it was a hard struggle. We travelled ever upwards, following what we at home would call sheep tracks, and as we got higher, the altitude began to tell and we were gasping for breath. We were so thankful for the hard work we had put in Judith's garden back in Berber, which had left us both reasonably fit. After 6 hours hard slog, we came to a kind of shepherd's hut, not unlike a Highland bothy in Scotland, where we thankfully rested and broke into our rations. We spent the rest of that night and all the next day there, enjoying the rest, and after a good wash and an ice-cold burn, we felt ready for anything. The climb seemed not to have bothered our guides in the least. They were as fresh as when we had started, and we were pretty stiff and sore. That night at sunset, we set off on the next stage, and after half an hour or so, the going became easier as we started to descend. And shortly afterwards, our guide informed us that we were in Spain, but that it would be necessary to proceed for another 10 or so miles, since escapees near the border were often returned into France. We carried on all that night. They travelled on into Spain, making their way to Barcelona by a workman's train. It's interesting and sad to me that far from being free once they received Barcelona, they were arrested and they were held with what James describes as the whole spectrum of offenders: thieves, pimps, forgers and political prisoners, with political prisoners making up the largest numbers. James's memoirs note that the British consular officer who came to speak to them treated them as if they were a nuisance and an embarrassment to the country. He describes the experiences of being in that prison. He was moved between various prisons, and he says that there was immense overcrowding. There was a real lack of food. and he talks about being handcuffed and attached in fours to a long chain to be marched through the town to another jail, and how humiliated he was by the experience. James spent over 3 weeks in various jails and internment camps, being given very little food and being forced to do tasks such as road building, road making, so hard physical jobs with very little food, and in a place where they had expected to find a little bit more support. James describes this 3 weeks as being like living in a hellhole, and says that any illusions that we may have had of Spain's interpretation of the Geneva Convention completely evaporated. However, after this they were rescued by an official from the embassy who came to meet with them and gave them clean clothes and food and arranged for their transportation to Gibraltar. He says, on arriving at the Rock, we were interrogated endlessly by intelligence officers and made to feel more like defaulters than heroic survivors of an epic campaign. This was now the 3rd of September, 16 months after our last brush with the Germans. We were attached to the Garrison Employment Company, but not yet allowed to communicate with home. I managed to persuade a Sergeant White, the friendly orderly sergeant, to write to my parents. They received his letter on September the 7th, the first communication since that letter from France in June, although they had received a letter from the Home Office informing them that they had lost trace of me, in which the Home Office plaintively asked them to inform them of any news. It wasn't until the 13th that I was able to send a cable home that said, "Here at last," and a few days later to post a letter to them. Mina's diary again records the family's excitement when this letter and the cable were received, and their huge relief, as you can imagine, that he had made it back to this side of the channel. Her diary of Tuesday the 7th of October 1941 says, "Had a wire from James, who has arrived at last on this side. He first came to Glasgow and he's now in London." And that's something recorded in James's memoirs as well, the fact that he went to Glasgow and then went to London. He says, "On the 20th we embarked on a Royal Naval cruiser for the Clyde. We arrived there 3 days later, but instead of getting leave from there, we were sent to London. There the last illusions of being greeted as returning heroes was dispelled. We were chivied around by administrative staff who had spent their war service in offices and had never heard a shot fired in anger, while being interrogated by supercilious army intelligence officers whose knowledge of war seemed to us to be on a different plane and unrelated to current events. Eventually we were adjudged properly screened and unlikely to be a threat to the war. We were issued again with new uniforms and unit badges, issued with railway warrants, and sent home on 2 weeks' leave." This is a really emotional little bit in his memoir. He says, "I was able to catch an afternoon train to Glasgow in time to catch the night train north to home. I arrived at Helmsdale the next morning to find my parents waiting for me. It was an almost unbearably emotional meeting. And then the last lap. The familiar road up to the Ord of Caithness, Ousdale, Berrydale, Dunbeath, Lathron, every twist and turn, almost every house a known family, all deeply etched in my memory. And finally, the old Portland Arms." I just think that's such a beautifully evocative thing. It was almost unbearably emotional to meet again. So this was in October 1941. James's father would die shortly after this in December 1941. James was dispatched from the Royal Army Ordnance Corps in January 1943, and his mother died in May 1945. James then took over the running of the Portland Arms. And in December 1945, after the war had ended, and I love this, I really love this, James was able, as soon as he physically could, was able to return to France to meet the farmer Emile Daniel and to thank him for all that he had done in sheltering him and risking his life to look after him. He also took time to visit the graves of fallen comrades. His visit was reported in the French press, and a copy of that was sent to him by one of the members of the French resistance who had helped him in his escape out of France. James married Jean Mackay from Achvanich, but the marriage was short-lived because James was to die only 10 years after returning home in January 1951 His experiences in Spain and France had taken a heavy toll on his health, and he'd never really recovered from all of that physical and mental strain. His funeral was enormous. There was a lorry needed to transport the floral tributes, and the obituary described him as someone who was always willing to extend a helping hand to anyone down on their luck or needing anything. I wonder perhaps if that's another legacy of his time in France and Spain, not only that physical legacy, but perhaps realising the importance of people who will put their neck out to support you when you need them. I really hope you've enjoyed hearing a little bit about James Mowat's story. Lovely comments coming up. It is like a Hollywood blockbuster, isn't it? And yes, brave people, Fiona, absolutely. So I hope you've enjoyed that little insight into a collection that's held at Nucleus. An amazing story. I hope you can join me next week. Next week we'll be into October, of course, and we'll be moving on to our theme of food and drink. And so next week's talk will be on whisky in the collections. We hold some distillery records, we hold some court records of people being arrested for illicit distilling, and so we're going to be looking at that subject next week. A reminder in the meantime that this series is brought to you by Highlife Island at no cost to the viewer. That Highlife Island is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in the Learn with Lorna films. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are truly grateful for that. Thank you.